Barlow. I'm the Director of Programs here at the Canadian Food Innovation Network. And today I'm happy to welcome and also thank for joining us Yadira from New Harvest. Yadira, I know that you're the Director of Research Collaborations at New Harvest, but from what I can see, your organization is fairly new to Canada and builds on a fairly lengthy or recent strong history in the United States. Could you tell us a little bit about New Harvest?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the invite, Alex. I'm really happy to be here and being able to present New Harvest and some of the work that we've been doing. So yeah, as you were saying, New Harvest is a nonprofit that was started in the US. And it's a nonprofit organization that focuses on supporting, funding, and conducting neglected research in the area of cellular agriculture. As you said, it's fairly new to Canada, but we have a long history of being working in the US and with a fellowship. Mostly, it's like our key program where we try to support researchers to conduct neglected research in this new field of creating animal products using cells. In Canada, we started, I would say, 2 years ago, and we actually announced it last year in 2022 as a nonprofit as well. And what we're trying to build is the ecosystem of cellular agriculture here as well, looking at all the potential and all the opportunities that we have here in Canada.
Awesome. Yeah, I've been listening to the Cultured Meat and Future Food podcast, and quite a few of the guests they have on are New Harvest Research Fellows, including one I was just listening to out of Tufts University. So you can see on that program. You guys have, in addition to the research support that you've provided, created a number of images and actually have a super informative website to sort of help perhaps those of us not as in the know as you are debunk or clarify what's going on in this space and the science behind it, because obviously it is quite technical. I've picked a few of those images, and I was hoping you would do me the favor of explaining them a little bit. So if you give me 1 second, I'll share my screen here. Should be able to see we've got this great yellow image of acellular products, and I wondered if you could take us through it a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I would say acellular products are some of the ones that we've been producing for quite a long time, even before we knew this was cellular agriculture. And they are produced by a process that is called precision fermentation. And what happened with these products, or something that they have really in common, is that they are products that won't have any cellular or living material once they are finally produced. We have some examples besides the ones that we have here, like insulin and rennet, that have been produced through this same process for quite some time. And what we can see here are some examples like ovalbumin that comes from eggs, some fatty acids. So it literally provides us an opportunity to have products that can be produced in bulk, and that we don't need like the whole product to actually obtain them. So imagine that we can create, for example, or obtain vanilla here in Canada instead of actually bringing it from countries really far away. So that's one of the advantages of using these products.
And I guess too, when we're thinking about this vanilla, it's not like the artificial vanilla versus the natural vanilla. It's the good stuff. It's the the proper stuff, not made up of chemicals. It is actually biosimilar, tastes the same, etc.
Yes, exactly. That's one of the advantages of using these technologies, that we can have products that are going to be pretty similar to the ones that we normally obtain through processing animals, for example.
Awesome. So then, of course, acellular, we get into the world of cellular. So I assume then we're talking about things a little different in terms of we do have some living cells through this process.
Exactly. So the difference now is that these products are going to contain the living cells or once living cells. And that's what the main difference between acellular and cellular products. So here, in order to obtain these products, we're going to take a small sample of cells coming from animals or plants, because we're seeing wood there also represented, and use these cells to expand them and differentiate into the type of tissue that we want. So we can obtain, for example, a small sample from the skin of an animal and use it to produce leather. And we can use the same process, obtain a little sample from a tree, the trunk or the bark of the tree, and just use it to create wood in this example.
If I understand it correctly, we take the cells, let's say it's a cell from the loin of a cow, or let's say it's wood, but we start by growing them in a bioreactor. Am I correct in that belief, usually with a cellular product?
Yes, so we will use the cells. We have a little more steps in between. So we will use the cell. We will actually isolate the cells that we really need, and then we will start growing them from maybe a petri dish and start just like increasing the scale until we can obtain enough cells to create a product that we want. And I can explain more about the whole process later on.
We've got a whole treasure trove of images. Absolutely. Well, here I've got one, of course, one of the more hyped topics of conversation in this area ends up being the cultivated meat type product. So this idea that we're going to eat a burger that really was never a cow. I mean, the cell came from a cow, but no cows were harmed in the making of the burger. So this one, I think, gives us some good concepts of how that process might work.
Yes. And this is one of my favorite ones to explain the actual process. So we have here the different elements that we need to produce a burger without actually using the whole animal. As we can see, we have the cow, and from that cow, we will obtain a tiny sample. Normally it's called a biopsy, that will contain the cells that we're going to use. It is important to know that there's different types of cells, and really each company or each scientist is using different processes to obtain a similar product. So normally what happens is that we will isolate the cells that we want. And then once we have those cells, there's two processes, one that is proliferation and the other one that is differentiation. So with proliferation, what happens is that we're going to multiply the cells. We're going to increase the number. And then those cells we're going to put them with nutrients or with growth factors, so the chemical molecules that we need to make those cells differentiate into the type of cell that we need, either muscle or fat, for example, which are the most common ones. What we see in the next step is the scaffolding. So normally in the body, these cells need something to attach on, to hold on, to start growing. And that's our connective tissue. In this case, we're going to use a scaffold. And this scaffold can be something coming from vegetables or something that is produced, for example, from collagen that is also produced through precision fermentation, for example. And once those cells are attached in the scaffold, everything will happen within a bioreactor, for example. And then we're going to use that material, like purified it, and use it to produce the burger that is the final product.
When I've heard about scaffolding before, I often hear people working in this space talk about 2D and then 3D. So I guess 2D is maybe before the scaffolding, is that right? And then 3D is maybe once we've made it a product with structure, as opposed to a liquid mass of cells, for example. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, so scaffolding will help us to create that 3D structure. It can be, the process can be more complex because there's different types of scaffolds, and we normally need something for the cells to attach. So in this drawing, for example, we have those tiny spheres that are called microcarriers that are also some sort of scaffold. So yeah, depending on the process again and the company, there's different ways in which we can produce it. And I forgot to mention another element is the growth media. The growth media is super important because it's the one that is going to provide all the nutrients for the cells to grow. In the body of an animal, we have our circulatory system that distributes all the nutrients to the cells. But in this case, we don't have that. So we have a bioreactor. And inside the bioreactor, we're going to have all this media with all these molecules that are needed, and the cells are going to grow inside it.
So are some of the things that might go in that media be things like carbohydrates or other things that, you know, mammalian bodies might use to create those sort of structures and cells?
Exactly. So we're going to have all the food for the cells. As you mentioned, we will have sugars, we will have amino acids that are going to be needed to actually produce all the proteins that are needed. We're going to have those growth factors, which are molecules that provide the signals for the cells to either multiply or differentiate. So all of that is going to be included in this rich fluid or liquid that is inside the bioreactor.
I assume when we take some of these cells, we're probably taking more like a muscle cell. But of course, there's a lot of delicious things that go into making our food tasty. For example, fats or some of the, I guess, the juiciness behind a burger. Can cellular agriculture provide us with the entire product and the same experience, or are we looking at maybe a very lean burger?
That's a pretty good question. And I guess it really depends again on in the process that scientists or companies are following. With cellular agriculture, we can use some types of cells that are called stem cells. And these stem cells can be turned into either muscle or fat, for example. So through cellular agriculture, we can obtain muscle cells that we are going to produce that the meat that we will have, but we can also produce and multiply fat cells that will give that juiciness or the marble characteristic that meat normally has. But it's also important to consider right now that this process is really, really expensive at this point, and that most of the current prototypes, I would say, are what we call hybrid. So right now, there are a combination of plant protein with some of these cells that are grown in culture. So there's a lot of, I think cellular agriculture gives us like a wide variety of possibilities of creating products and mixing them in the way that we can obtain something that is also attractive for consumers, that is safe, and that is also accessible.
Yeah, it's a lot of work to recreate what sort of the world has been doing through natural processes for a long time. But it's crazy actually to consider how far it's come and how exciting some of the developments have been of late. I know I've seen articles about chicken nuggets, salmon, all sorts of different products. And of course, not only in cultivated meat, which maybe takes us into our next picture, where we come back to perhaps some of the acellular products. And of course, I believe this image, which is giving us some overviews of precision fermentation.
Yes. As I was telling you, precision fermentation, even though we call it like that now, it's been a process or a method that we've been using for a long time already. So what we see here is the main machinery that we use for precision fermentation, which is like a microbe. And what happened is that we use the genetic information of the protein or the molecule that we want. Right now, we have a lot of databases where scientists can actually get that genetic information or the recipe, let's say, for producing a protein. And what we normally do, or scientists do, is that they use that genetic information and create a vehicle to insert that information inside the microbe. Then what happens is that the microbe is going to use that information as its own, and it's going to start expressing and translating that information into the molecule that we want. So that's what we try to represent in this image. So getting the information from a database, using a vehicle to insert it to a microbe, and then really using the microbe as our factory to produce the proteins that we want. And as I mentioned before, here the protein won't contain the cells, so won't contain any microbe at all. And that's also one of the biggest advantages of precision fermentation.
So, I mean, obviously fermentation we're familiar with, and I know certainly we've escalated that technology to make all sorts of things, including a variety of human health type solutions in the medical world. What kind of products? I know earlier we talked about casein and vanillin. Are there other things that we can make through precision fermentation? Are we able to make the same sort of cellular products that we talked about earlier, or is that really through that more a different process?
So products like, for example, the burger won't be possible at this point with precision fermentation, because with precision fermentation, we only give the instruction of a single molecule. Right. So if we talk, for example, about milk, so we don't really obtain milk through precision fermentation. What we obtain is casein, for example, which is one of the proteins that that forms part of milk. If we talk, for example, about egg is also, it has different types of proteins, but through precision fermentation, we can get the genetic information of one protein and just produce that protein.
Okay. But still useful, especially since we know some of these proteins have some really great attributes for human health, or like vanillin or things like that might have some specific properties that are desirable on their own.
Yes.
My next one takes us into the world of eggs, actually. I think we were touching on that a little bit. Why don't you take us through this one?
Yes, so this image really tries to compare the two processes for obtaining eggs. So when we think about eggs, we might think about the image that we have, like a sunny side egg with a egg white and a yolk in the middle. But one of the advantages of precision fermentation is that if we only need one of those elements, we can create it without really having to have the whole product or the whole egg in this case. For example, something interesting about eggs is that we use eggs in different processes for food production, like for bakery or for confectionery, because of the properties that the proteins have. So through precision fermentation, we can actually obtain those proteins that are pretty important for bakery or for confectionery without needing to produce a whole bunch of eggs. So again, what happened here is that we obtain the genetic information of, let's say, the egg white, and then insert it into one of these microbes. It can be a bacteria or a yeast, and then they are gonna express the protein based on the instructions that we give them. And some of the advantages I would say of using this process is that precision fermentation allows us to have a more consistent quality of the product. We can produce bigger quantities of that product, and that could also help with the cost, for example. Another benefit, which is really important, is animal-free, which is a huge concern. Even right now, also with issues with climate change and animal welfare. So that's also an advantage of using precision fermentation. And the protein that we will have the same properties. So egg white, for example, helps us with foaming or binding properties. So it will have the same properties with a more consistent quality.
So bacteria could make us a really delicious meringue one day.
Exactly.
Yeah. When I wonder, you're talking earlier about the price and some of the affordability elements around a cultivated meat product. What are some of the, obviously there's challenges in optimizing growth medias and getting how to scaffold your product so that it looks like a burger, or it has that muscle tissue type structure. What are some of the challenges they're facing in precision fermentation as they look to grow this new area of science? Like, are they able to really easily make egg proteins today? Is it about trying to better concentrate what you get out of the bacteria, or is there a lot of work to do around the bioreactors?
That's a pretty good question. And I would say, in general, one of the challenges for these novel processes is achieving the scale that we need to substitute animal production. As I was reading about egg production, and it seems we produce like billions of eggs. So trying to reach those quantities using this new technology is still pretty challenging, mostly because, for example, the equipment. We don't have bioreactors with the capacity still that we need to produce that amount of protein for food. So I think there's still some challenges in terms of scaling up the whole supply chain for cellular agriculture, so that we can achieve the amounts that we need.
So a ways to go, but it does seem these days like there's more and more happening with these companies. So hopefully with some more attention and, of course, as always, investment, we can see some bigger volumes. I think if I remember correctly, this year, one of the first actual production facilities in the world will come online in Singapore. Am I correct in that? I thought it was this year that they would come online.
Do you mean like a pilot?
I think they've got a site, coming up in Singapore was my understanding. Maybe it is a pilot facility.
For culture meat or precision fermentation?
I thought it was for chicken nuggets, but
okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I heard about the. Yes, so I feel there's been already some companies announcing their pilot facilities. But I still feel there's some challenges in order for making them actively
to even mainstream.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
I know we had late last year the first company approved by the FDA with their product, which bodes well, but I'm sure that there's still obviously a lot of work to do. And if your product still costs several $100,000 to manufacture, it's probably going to be a little while before the bulk of us will have the chance to try them.
Yes, definitely.
My last image, I think, takes us through a similar process, but I believe this is for rennet.
Yes, and I really like to use rennet as an example of how, again, we've used already cellular agriculture for quite some time, and how it actually helped to obtain an animal product without needing to depend on these animals for the production of these kind of products. So rennet is a mixture of enzymes that are used for cheese production. And these enzymes, what help is to separate the solid from the liquid components of milk and get those curds that we need for cheese making. Originally, as we can see in the image, rennet was obtained from baby calves, from the stomachs of baby calves. So a lot of the material or the inputs that were used for rennet production were the stomachs or the byproduct of veal production. So this was a type of rennet that was used originally for cheese making. But as cheese making started to be more popular, then the amounts of rennet that were needed were also bigger. And then people start realizing that there was inconsistency in the quality or the functionality of this rennet. The cost was also different, or it will vary based on the availability of materials to obtain this rennet. So that's when scientists started to think like, well, how can we obtain this product without really depending on the availability of raw materials, and something that is more consistent in quality and functionality. And that's how precision fermentation came to the play. Again, they use the genetic code for the enzymes that form part of rennet, especially the enzyme that is called chymosin.
Okay.
And they inserted that genetic information again in a microbe, and they use a microbe as the machinery to produce chymosin. And I was actually reading, and chymosin right now, most of the chymosin that we use right now for cheese making comes from precision fermentation rather than from animal production. So that's a clear example of how these methods could help to develop processes that are more controlled, products that have better quality, more consistent quality, and in quantities that can help to make it more affordable as well.
Yeah, interesting. One thing I've been thinking about as you've been talking is sometimes in food and in animal production, you end up with a bit of a challenge around the use of the whole animal, and always having markets for that. And I think we do often use the whole animal, but there's such an advantage here to get exactly what you're looking for in the volumes that you need it without necessarily creating a lot of food waste, or, again, without requiring, in this case, veal. So a really interesting strategy for solving things like ingredient shortages or challenges from climate change in terms of growing or having enough food for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess an important element to think about is that when we depend also on materials, let's talk about rennet that comes from animals or living beings, it is challenging to maintain the same exact quality of the products, because that's just like nature doesn't work like that. And when we're going to do something for other processes, that becomes a challenge as well to keep everything consistent. And precision fermentation, these new technologies can help us with that as well, and create processes that are more efficient as well.
Well, that takes us to the end of our images. I wanted to ask you about one last thing. Just let me stop sharing my screen here. I was reading a little bit on your website about New Harvest's new campaign, Cellular Agriculture for the Public Good. I think in a lot of ways we've touched, obviously, on how cellular agriculture could help contribute to the public good. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that campaign that you're launching.
Yeah, sure. I think when we talk about cellular agriculture, there's a lot of promises that come with the term. A lot of people think that cellular agriculture will help us to create a more sustainable food system that will help us also with mitigating climate change, that can help us with food security, public health. But a lot of that will really depend it will depend on us ensuring that the technology is actually accessible, that the technology is actually feasible, that all the elements, for example, to ensure that the products are going to be safe are there. So there's a lot of things that are still needed in order for cellular agriculture to become this force of good. But for that, we still need to overcome a lot of challenges. For example, one of the challenges we've seen a lot in cellular agriculture or culture meat mostly is a lack of public information. And one of the reasons is because a lot of this research is being done in industry or in companies, and they've been mostly funded by private investments. So that makes them be more siloed and be more careful of the information that they share. So I think there's a lot of work that we need to do to create an environment that is more collaborative, where we can, for example, promote more open innovation models, create systems for exchanging knowledge and sharing knowledge in a way that there's a balance between public and private. Mm-hmm. And that can also help us accelerate the pace of innovation. We know that if we work in silos, sometimes we might be duplicating work. Mm-hmm. There might be work that a company knows is not going to work, but the other company doesn't know. So how can we create a more collaborative environment? How can we create systems where companies, researchers, the government also participate, share ideas, exchange knowledge? How can we create systems where we can think beyond economic incentives as well? Mm-hmm. There's other things that we also need to understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny, just because you think a system might be more equitable or fair, or it addresses some concerns you have about other systems, doesn't mean it necessarily will end up being more equitable or fair. It has to be designed with a lot of intention. And I think it's awesome that you guys are looking at that. I definitely think there are some common challenges. And actually, you and I, in previous conversations, you've brought these up, things like consumer safety, good manufacturing practices, quality control. These are all problems, you're right, all the companies working in this space will run into. And why not build on their knowledge and assets as opposed to duplicating these efforts? Because, of course, they have a lot of work to do regardless of these small efforts. There's a long way to go here for these products and for these companies.
Definitely. I think there's a need for more coordination in terms of the work that everyone is doing, especially considering we are in a time-sensitive situation with climate change, where we really need to take action to mitigate effects that we are already seeing. So I think we really need to find ways to coordinate and collaborate more.
Well, it's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation is that the Canadian Food Innovation Network is launching our 4th Food Innovation Challenge, focused on cellular agriculture and, more importantly, food-related products. And that's one of the questions we're asking our collaborations to look at, or what are some of these challenges that they could help us and help each other address through their projects, and how can we take the whole sector forward as opposed to just one individual company. I think it's a big part of actually having an impact beyond just the firms that we fund, but impacting the food sector as a whole. So
exactly.
I want to say thank you so much for taking time to chat with us. I highly recommend anyone who's looking to understand this space, investigate New Harvest further. I know I've watched some TED Talks from your organization. I've been reading your website, and it's helped me really establish a baseline understanding of this space, which for most of us, I think you too come from a policy background, is maybe not exactly, something we're all super familiar with unless you graduate, out of a science-based program. So I really want to say thank you again for explaining this to us and for being such a great resource for our members.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex, and everyone. Happy to answer any questions anytime. Reach out.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.